Mrs. Anderson had been teaching 7th grade science for nearly 2 decades. Though passionate about her subject, her patience for unruly students had waned over the years. She began to dread certain class periods, especially the one with Jordan. Jordan was the kind of student who didn't seem to care. He'd show up late, his clothes rumpled, and his notebooks perpetually empty. While the other students eagerly engaged in lab experiments, Jordan would slump at his desk, doodling in the margins of his textbook. Mrs. Anderson started to see him as a lost cause, and her frustration often boiled over into short, cutting remarks. "Jordan," she snapped one afternoon, "is there a reason you even bother coming to class if you're just going to waste everyone's time?" The words hung heavy in the air. Jordan looked up for a moment, his eyes sharp with an emotion Mrs. Anderson couldn't quite place. Anger? Sadness? Then he went back to doodling. As weeks turned into months, Jordan's grades plummeted. His classmates, sensing Mrs. Anderson's disdain, began to mock him behind his back. The once mild teasing turned into outright bullying, and Jordan withdrew further. Mrs. Anderson, overwhelmed by the demands of teaching, let happen. She told herself that life was tough, and Jordan needed to toughen up. But one day, while cleaning her desk, Mrs. Anderson stumbled upon a folder left by the previous year's guidance counselor. It contained a note about Jordan's family situation. His father had passed away 2 years earlier, and his mother had recently lost her job. The family was struggling to keep their home. It was no wonder Jordan's focus had shifted. He was carrying a weight no 12-year-old should bear. A wave of guilt washed over Mrs. Anderson. She had been so focused on Jordan's outward behavior that she'd failed to see the burden he was carrying. That evening, she stayed late at school, preparing a new lesson plan tailored specifically to spark Jordan's interest. She added more hands-on experiments, allowed more creative expression in assignments, and resolved to speak to him with kindness instead of criticism. The next day, Mrs. Anderson approached Jordan's desk. "Hey, Jordan," she said softly, "I've noticed you like to draw. I'm planning an art project that connects with our lesson on ecosystems. Would you help me design it?" Jordan blinked at her, unsure how to respond. He nodded slightly and picked up his pencil. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Anderson continued to support Jordan, encouraging him to share his drawings, pairing him with classmates who were kind, and quietly praising his progress. Jordan began to open up, asking questions in class and turning in his assignments. By the end of the year, his grades had improved, and he seemed genuinely curious about science. On the last day of school, as students said their goodbyes, Jordan approached Mrs. Anderson with a small gift, a neatly folded paper crane. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said. Mrs. Anderson held the crane in her hand. Its delicate folds a reminder of how easily a child's spirit could break, and how much a teacher's compassion could mend it. She realized that the smallest gestures of kindness could reignite a student's spark and create a lasting impact. It's important to look beyond a person's behavior to understand their struggles. A little patience, empathy, and encouragement can transform lives and create bonds that last a lifetime.